We shall commence this module by discussing about the objectives of developing countries in brief. The ultimate objective of all developing countries is to achieve the highest level of economic growth. These economies possess enough natural and manpower resources, but these have remained underutilized. The real rate of growth has remained below the targeted rate due to the shortage of capital and other resources. There is no doubt that markets do act in a way that they tend to discourage competition and thus bring about efficiency in the system. But markets cannot be trusted to improve the status of the poor, where the state has to play a positive role. As Stiletto states, market economies are not self-regulating. They cannot simply be left on autopilot, especially if one wants to ensure that the benefits are shared widely. The state therefore has to play the roles of producer, regulator and supplier of social goods like education, health, drinking water, etc. The state is equipped with different policies to perform the functions. Here we shall limit ourselves to the role of only monetary and fiscal policy in the process of development. After studying this model, you shall be able to understand the role of monetary policy in economic development. B. Know about the role of fiscal policy in economic development. C. Learn about the instruments of monetary and fiscal policy. Let's first understand the role of monetary policy. Monetary policy generally refers to those policy measures of the central bank which are adopted to control and regulate the supply of money and the cost and availability of credit in a country. According to Harry G. Johnson, the monetary policy refers to a regulatory policy whereby the central bank maintains the control over the supply of money. The role of monetary policy is not limited to control the supply of money. As in growing economy, the monetary authority has to moderate the credit and money supply in such a way that the requirements of industry and trade are met, but there is a curb on the use of credit for unproductive and speculative motives. Thus, according to Paul Enzi, the ideal monetary policy is defined as the effort to reduce to a minimum the disadvantages resulting from the existence and the operation of monetary system. We shall here examine the basic objectives, instruments, efficacy and limitations of monetary policy. Objectives. Following are the main objectives of monetary policy. A. The exchange rate stability. Since all the economies of the world are open economies who have trade relations with each other, exchange rate stability is required to maintain stability in the balance of payment. Monetary policy seeks to regulate exchange rate in a manner that can improve exports and can generate surplus in the balance of trade. B. Full employment. Full employment is a situation wherein all those who are able and willing to work at the prevailing rates of wages get employment. To achieve it, the level of demand and output should increase. For this, there is a need for lower rate of interest which will make credit cheaper. It will reduce the cost of production, which will increase both the level of output and the level of demand. This in turn will increase the level of employment. In order to maintain this level of employment during the period of depression, monetary policy must adjust accordingly and effort should be made to maintain stability between savings and investment. C. Economic growth. Another equally important objective of monetary policy is economic growth. While in developed countries, the main objective of the policy is to maintain the full employment level, in underdeveloped countries, the major problem is to raise the level of real income per capita. The low income levels in these economies are due to the low rate of capital formation, due to which these economies fail to utilize their natural and human resources, keeping their production capacity low. Monetary policy here can play a crucial role in promoting investment and accelerating the rate of capital formation, as well as discouraging investment in less useful activities. D. Price stability. Another objective for which monetary policy has been used in most of the developing economies is to attain internal price stability. Price stability here means the elimination of wide fluctuations in prices, which can not only disrupt the smooth working but can also lead to insecurity and social injustice. While inflation creates hardships to fixed income groups and consumers, deflation is disastrous for both entrepreneurs and labor. Monetary policy seeks to eradicate both these trends in the system. Since the effects of price instability are always cumulative, the monetary policy in the developing countries should help in maintaining price stability over a long period. E. Reduction in economic inequality. In most of the capitalist and mixed economies, there is a widespread inequalities in the distribution of wealth and income, which divides the society into two classes. One of the objectives of monetary policy is to work as an instrument in achieving equitable distribution of both income and wealth. The basic instruments which are used by monetary authorities are: A. Bank rate. It refers to a rate of discount at which the central bank rediscounts the approved bills of exchange, or it is the rate payable by commercial banks on the loans of the central bank. Bank rate and other rates of interest are interrelated. A change in bank rate brings about a corresponding changes in the rate of interest. Bank rate policy affects the flow of credit by influencing A. the demand for credit, B. the cost of credit, and C. the availability of credit. An increase in bank rate will result in contraction in demand and increase in cost and a smaller supply of bank credit, as it is a signal for credit squeeze. In contrast, a fall in bank rate will result in expansion of demand as well as an expansion of availability of credit. But in developing economies, the unorganized money market, the external cyclical pressures and excess reserves with the commercial banks put a limit to the success of bank rate policy. The second instrument of monetary policy is the open market operations. It involves buying and selling of securities by the central bank in the market. When the central bank sells securities, a part of money in circulation is withdrawn and the cash reserves of the commercial banks will be reduced. As a result, money supply is reduced, and this may help in controlling inflationary pressures. Similarly, during deflation, central bank will start purchasing securities which will increase the cash balances with the commercial market, commercial banks and the economy. Open market operations by sale and purchase of securities also affect the cost of credit. The techniques of open market operation is superior to bank rate as it has a direct effect on availability of liquidity with the banks. Since the initiative remains in the hands of the central bank, it has a direct influence on the cash reserves. In many of the developing economies where the security market is not well developed, the open market operations may have limited effects as any large scale sale of securities may lower their prices and may disturb the borrowing of the economy and the government. Therefore, many monetary economists assert that bank rate policy and open market operations should be used as a complementary measure in the field of monetary management. Another instrument of monetary policy is the variable reserve ratios. The commercial banks are required by law to keep a ratio of their aggregate demand and time deposits with the central bank. This technique can also be used for combating inflationary pressures. The monetary authority has the right to change this ratio. Although a high CRR adversely affects the profitability of commercial banks. In the Indian system, it was as high as 15% in 1990-91, from where it has been continuously reduced to 4% recently. Similarly, all commercial banks are legally bound to keep a part of their deposit in the liquid form, which is known as statutory liquidity ratio. The monetary authority has the power to determine SLR for the commercial banks so as to ease inflationary pressures as well as making large resources available to the state. Another instrument of monetary policy is repo rate and reverse repo rate. Repo rate is the rate at which the monetary authority lends to the commercial banks, and the reverse repo rate is the rate which is paid by the authority on the funds kept by the commercial banks with it. Thus, by repo rate, the monetary authority injects liquidity into the system, and by reverse repo rate, it absorbs the liquidity from the system. The Indian Monetary Authority, that is RBI, has stopped using bank rate and has decided to shift to a single policy rate regime of repo rate, and the reverse repo rate is pegged at 1% below the repo rate. Another instrument of monetary policy which is directed for the developing economies is the qualitative controls. In developing economies, monetary authorities not only use quantitative methods of control as the money supply, but also controls the credit to specific areas of economic activities so that speculative activities in essential commodities can be prevented and the inflationary effects are checked. The whole idea is the availability of funds for production, movement of goods and export is not affected adversely, but there should be effective control against speculative hoardings. Monetary policy thus can emerge as an important instrument of economic management and can help in correcting economic ills and can also help in achieving many macroeconomic goals. It can ensure a smooth functioning of the economy if a number of preconditions are met. It can contribute to sustainable economic growth by maintaining a low and stable price situation. If during the growth process an expansionary fiscal policy is used which will expand both plan and non-plan expenditure, monetary policy has to play a difficult role. On the one hand, it is required to facilitate the fulfillment of the basic objectives of growth, and on the other, it has to play the role of countervailing force. The fact is that in developing economies, there are certain conditions due to which the success of monetary policy is limited. For example, there is a persistence of unorganized money and capital market on which the monetary authority has no control. B, as these economies lack integrated structure of rate of interest, changes in the bank rate do not affect the market rate of interest. C, people are illiterate and do not have banking habits. D, there is lack of coordination and cooperation between the monetary authority and the other banks, etc. Since the success of monetary policy depends upon various factors like availability of widespread banking institutions, banking habits, adequate bank deposits, and entrepreneurial ability, etc., the limitations of these put an obstacle and limits the ability of monetary policy to do good single-handedly. Moving on to discuss the role of fiscal policy, monetary policy alone cannot achieve the objective of sustained economic growth, stability, and social justice in a developing economy. Therefore, it is necessary that the monetary policy be supplemented by an effective fiscal policy, and both monetary and fiscal policies taken together can prove to be very effective in achieving the objectives of growth with stability. Fiscal policy refers to the policy of the government as regards taxation, public expenditure, and public borrowings with specific objectives in view. According to Arthur Smithies, fiscal policy is a policy under which the government uses its expenditure and revenue programs to produce desirable effects and avoid undesirable effects on national income, production, and employment. In fact, fiscal policy is a technique to attain and maintain full employment by manipulating and maintain full employment, public expenditure, and revenue in such a way as to keep equilibrium between effective demand and supply of goods and services at a particular time, thus making it a policy based on the principle of functional finance. Moving to the objectives of fiscal policy, the objectives of fiscal policy differ from economy to economy according to their level of economic development. While in developed economies, the role of fiscal policy is to stabilize the rate of growth and to maintain the level of full employment, in the developing economies, fiscal policy aims at accelerating the rate of capital formation, a change in the pattern of investment, maintaining sufficient supply of essential consumer goods on the one hand and capital goods on the other. It also aims at just an equitable distribution of national product. Sometimes these objectives come in conflict with each other, as the objective of high growth rate may come in conflict with the distributive objective. Similarly, equitable distribution may adversely affect the rate of saving, investment, and thus retard the rate of economic growth, but efforts should be made to achieve reconciliation between these conflicts. The basic objectives of fiscal policy in a developing economy are influencing growth by influencing a mobilization of resources. Since most of developing economies are caught in the vicious circle of poverty which keeps a poor country in a state of poverty, the aim of fiscal policy is to break this vicious circle of poverty. For this, there is an utmost need to increase the rate of investment and capital formation so as to accelerate the rate of growth. This can be done through voluntary savings, but as the level of per capita income is very low, enough voluntary savings are not available. The government therefore has to depend upon taxation and public borrowings. Fiscal policy can mobilize more resources if it is able to prevent the growth of black money and restrict the non-planned expenditure of the government. By curbing black money, the consumption expenditure on luxury services can be reduced and saving propensity can be raised. Efficient allocation of resources. The growth performance of an economy is not only influenced by the availability of resources but also by an efficient and rational allocation of these resources. A fiscal policy which is indifferent to efficient resource allocation retards the productive capacity of the economy and thereby the rate of economic growth. Among the various instruments, tax structure can be an effective determinant of the efficiency of use of resources. A progressive tax policy, a balance in the ratios of direct and indirect taxes, and a rational tax structure can affect both the revenue generation and the competitiveness. Besides, the expenditure policy of the government should also ensure the efficiency of resource use. Fiscal policy and equity. Maintaining equity in the distribution is not only an objective but a precondition of economic growth. The fiscal policy should be formulated in such a way that its various instruments are able to reduce disparity in the society so as to reduce political and social discontentment which generates instability in the economy. For this, the fiscal policy should have a redistributed public expenditure and tax policy. Progressive tax policy, a curb on black money, and higher expenditure of the government on social services or in areas which benefit the poor can reduce the gap between rich and poor. To accelerate employment opportunities, by adopting counter-cyclical fiscal policy under which government spending being cut and taxes increased in the expanding phase of the business cycle and reducing taxes and increment government expenditure in contracting phase can open new job opportunities in the economy. A progressive tax policy will be both socially desirable and economically advantageous. Similarly, public debt policy can be used to control the non-essential private consumption expenditure as well as to raise small savings which can be used for financing the development expenditure and increase employment opportunities. Another objective of fiscal policy is price stability. Since developing economies face the problem of shortage of capital and the scope of taxation and public debt is limited, the government resorts to deficit financing. This increase in supply of money creates inflationary conditions in the economy. A continuous increase in prices raises the cost of development projects. The fiscal policy, therefore, should aim at curbing inflationary pressures which is inherent in the developing economies due to imbalance between demand and supply. For this, a package of fiscal measures can be adopted which may include the withdrawal of purchasing power through taxes, compulsory savings and public borrowings. Tax policy should be progressive so that it should not harm the poorer sections and should encourage voluntary savings. Although fiscal measures are insulators against inflation, theoretically, as the government can raise taxes, decrease expenditure, increase public borrowings to mop up purchasing power, and can adopt a surplus budget policy. But practically, these measures have limited success as frequent changes in the fiscal measures are not possible. Fiscal policy works through four principal instruments: taxation policy, government expenditure policy, both on goods and services and on transfer payments, public debt policy and deficit financing. Taxation is the most significant measure of fiscal policy which directly affects people's disposable income and thereby the market demand. There are two types of taxes which can be used to moderate the pressure of demand. Theoretically, during inflation, the rates of direct taxes like income tax, expenditure tax should be increased or some new taxes should be levied so that less money is left in the hands of the people, which will reduce consumption expenditure and thereby the market demand. Indirect taxes, if increased, add to the cost and are thus passed on to the buyers in the form of increased prices. Therefore, indirect taxes are generally not increased during the inflationary situation as these will add to the inflation. Taxation policy may also affect the level of investment. A policy of tax reduction and tax concession gives incentive to investment and thereby helps in increasing output, income and employment and to faster growth of the economy. On the other hand, high tax rates may provide disincentive to investment and a fall in investment may lead to a fall in income and the aggregate demand. The second instrument is expenditure. Fiscal policy, by reducing public expenditure during inflation and by increasing government expenditure during depression, can help in maintaining stability in the economy. The problem with public expenditure policy is that it is the non-developmental expenditure which deteriorates the fiscal situation. The fiscal deficit, which indicates the total resource gap between government expenditure and the government revenue, is a matter of concern. To finance this deficit, if the government resorts to deficit financing, there is always an apprehension of a rise in prices. To reduce this deficit, the government can increase taxation and can reduce public expenditure. But in case of a rational tax structure, when tax rates cannot be raised, it is a reduction in public expenditure which should be used. While doing so, the government should not reduce the capital expenditure as a ratio of GDP, otherwise the infrastructure development and thus the overall growth process would be disrupted. Besides, there should be a check on direct subsidies and the interest payments which entail a large claim on public revenues. It should be managed properly. Next, we shall talk about the public debt. The market demand is also influenced by public debt policy. Public debt is of two kinds, internal and external debt. In order to meet the increasing requirements of expenditure, both central and state governments raise debts. The burden of public debt is not limited to the interest burden only. Much depends on how these funds are used. If a major part of the public debt is spent on unproductive activities, it becomes a deadweight loss to the economy. But if these funds are used on developmental activities, they raise the productive capacity of the economy. Public debt policy can be used to control the non-essential private consumption expenditure and to raise small savings for financing the development expenditure in these developing economies. The government can issue bonds with attractive rates of interest to encourage people to purchase these. But no developing economy can depend too much upon public debt policy for the development process, because debt policy will prove effective only when these funds are collected through the idle balances lying with the people. If the public borrowing results in the fall in current consumption expenditure or reduces investment in the private sector, it will not have desirable effects. So, our evaluation is, there is no doubt that fiscal policy, by adopting a combination of different instruments, can help in achieving the objectives of economic growth by mobilizing resources, can help in reducing inequalities through redistribution, can also help in stabilizing prices, but the measures of fiscal policy are mostly long-term measures. Besides, there are information lags, policy formation lags, and execution lags in the implementation of the policy. Fiscal policy has achieved great success in the developed countries. It has a multidimensional role in the developing countries as it aims at improving the growth performance of the economy and ensuring social justice to the people. But the nature and fundamental characteristics of the developing economies are responsible for only a partial success of this policy. The tax structure in these economies is narrow and rigid. A well-knit integrated tax policy is required for the success of fiscal measures conducive to economic growth. The non-monetized sector in the developing economies puts an obstacle in effective implementation of the fiscal measures. Since majority of the people are poor and illiterate, they neither understand the implications of the fiscal policy nor can they contribute to the government revenue. Besides, there is a large-scale tax evasion due to which the government failed to collect the required amount from taxes. Besides, the administrative machinery is honestly and effectively incapable to execute fiscal policy. The developing economies even lack proper statistical information as regards savings, investment, employment, etc., which makes it difficult for the public authorities to formulate a rational and effective fiscal policy. The market imperfections, the bottlenecks, the shortages, and lack of entrepreneurial skills do not allow fiscal policy to work effectively. Let's now summarize what we have learned in this module. The ultimate aim of developing economies is to attain a high level of economic growth, and the main obstacle in the path are the paucity of capital, technical know-how, and certain social institutions. The state, equipped with monetary and fiscal policy, can keep an overall control on the economy, but one policy in the absence of the other cannot achieve the objectives of sustained growth, stability, and social justice. It is therefore essential that both monetary and fiscal policies should play a complementary role to each other to take the developing economies from a stage of primary backwardness to a stage of self-sustained growth.